I've got coffee with me to keep me awake during the presentation. So I was pretty fortunate. I grew up in the business. My dad started in 1949 and run it since 72. But as a little kid, I was really fortunate. We'd go to Gallup Ceremonial and we'd camp out on the Red Rock where a lot of the Indian families came. By the way, I'm going to use the term Indian, all right? I'm going to use American Indian. I'm not going to use Native American. No less an authority I cite than Joy Harjo, who was our poet laureate, first Native American poet laureate for three consecutive sessions. And she was writing about Indian country, and then right after she used that phrase, she said, Indian country, not Native American country. So if Joy can endorse that, I'm going to use that as well. But I can remember going to the Gallup ceremony, and we'd camp out up on top of the Red Rock. And it was still a time when, more often than even pickups, you saw wagons, still covered wagons, and families cooking there. It was just a great time. And so I've been privileged to see a transition from covered wagons to the internet. And I really appreciate the fact that you commemorated the first flat screen TV and the painting of it, by the way. But as Eric said, I was raised by a skeptic. So if something's common knowledge, okay, that's interesting, but now prove it. And so for a lot of things, I look for 2 and 3 sources before I said, okay, that's true. Or decide that it's not true. I'm working on a book on the history of Southwest Indian jewelry. We're working on it for longer than I care to disclose, and part of what's taken so long, I'm only up to the 70s now, the 1970s fortunately, is that there are so many myths out there. And the crazy thing is, they're coming at me faster and faster. Thank you, Internet. And we'll get into that a little bit, but it's been an interesting career so far. My daughter keeps asking me when I'm going to retire, and it's like, and do what? But one of the things that's happened, I probably have ADHD. Is as I've been doing the research, I go down the rabbit hole with other topics, and I finally, my editor said, no, you can't do a sidebar, no footnotes. I'm like, oh, and no parenthetical comments or observations or whatever. So I told him, I said, if you're going to do this book, you're going to have to agree to do the second volume, which is going to be entitled Everything That Didn't Fit in the First One. But it's so damn interesting. It's led me to Nicholas Appert. It's led me to Napoleon. Napoleon wanted to find out ways to get meat that didn't spoil to his troops, and he had a prize for it, and Nicholas Appert came up with the first canning. That was 1809. Well, that came to the United States, and that made it possible for all those canned goods and all those shelves of all those traders. It led me to time zones. By the way, if you have not read Stephen Fried's book, Appetite for America on Fred Harvey, you must read it. Fabulous book. And he also went down his share of rabbit holes. He talks about the establishment of time zones, because at one time, every town on the frontier, every town east of the Mississippi decided, oh, well, let's set it to 12 o'clock and 50 miles away. I think it's more like 1:30. So you can imagine what a nightmare it was for the timekeepers for the railroads. And so the railroads prevail upon the federal government to create time zones, and they propose them. And this will sound real familiar, but the attitude was, the government ain't telling me what time it is. So the railroad said, all right, we're doing this, and they just simply let everybody know these are going to be the time zones, and we're going to set the schedules, and that's that. And everybody went, well, if the railroads think it's a good idea, we'll go along with it. And it led to Herman Schweitzer, who was a very prominent figure with the Harvey Company, but he started out as a clerk in a little dinky railroad side town, And some cowboys came in and had a meal. And Fred Harvey actually cooked his meat pretty decently, instead of just putting it and frying it or cooking it in water, kind of tough. Anyhow, they had a meal and they got up to leave and decided it wasn't necessary to pay. So young Herman Schweitzer grabbed this blunderbuss, honestly got a blunderbuss off the wall, and pointed it at him and said, "You need to pay." And they did. And what made him famous was that thing was an antique. It hadn't seen a grain of black powder in probably 50 years or so. And just a lot of things, brazing versus soldering. Everybody talks about soldering in pieces together in Indian jewelry. It's actually brazing. It's a technical point that would make most people snooze, but I'm like, oh, really? One of the, when the Santa Fe Trail opened, there was, it wasn't a single trail, it was multiple trails that threaded together and eventually wound up in Santa Fe. And one of the first people there was a fellow named Augustus Storrs, who actually wound up being a major supporter and founder of the University of Connecticut. So these traders weren't like operating in a vacuum out here with cowboy hats on it. They had deep Eastern roots on them. Early on, it was really, it was a tough road and tough business, but the profits were amazing. About a 6-time markup. In 2 years, he sold $400,000 in early $1,800, so you don't even want to imagine what that is now. And what I like is the fact that 12,000 of that was in whiskey. And adjusted for 2020 prices, that's $1.3 million in whiskey he sold in 2 years. He also sold $15.40 in Bibles. And you read these bills of lading, and it's stuff that should be boring. It's just fascinating as all get out. Besides the ladies' bonnets and window glass, there was champagne and oysters. And I'm like, hold on, oysters? We're going back to Napoleon, canned oysters. Well, at one time, oysters were so popular in the East, the average New Yorker ate 600 oysters a year. It's down to about 3 now, given the population. And there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 160 million pounds of oysters being harvested. Well, even if you're eating 600 a year, it's like, no, I'm sorry, we can't handle that. But canning them provided another market, because now you could safely eat them, even if you were more than a day away from the oyster beds on it. So they wound up on shelves on the Navajo Reservation in trading posts there. The first trading post that was licensed was in 1866 to a guy named Willie Spielberg, who President Cleveland later appointed as the first territorial governor of New Mexico. So these guys were politically connected as well. They weren't, like I say, guys with cowboy hats decided to come out and make their fortune. They recreated themselves in that process. And he had got his first trading post, and his brother Layman got one at, what was it, Fort's name? Fort Defiance. These are really camps. There really weren't any permanent structures there. The trading posts were basically wall tents with 2 barrels and a plank laid across it. And a lot of traders would simply load up their covered wagons and go around to different settlements and sell, whatever goods they thought the Navajo might be interested in. And initially, primarily things like flour, coffee, staples of life, and sugar and things of that sort. But they had a younger brother. I don't know how many of you are younger brothers and how many of you have younger brothers, but they're a breed apart, right? And he had a different vision. And so he was going to, setting up a wall tent just wasn't his idea of trading with the Indians. So he was going to go with a wagon, but covered wagons, boring. He found an abandoned circus wagon and convinced his brothers to buy it for him, and he would load it up with goods and take it across the reservation. Now, if that wasn't memorable for some Navajo family out on the Chusca Plateau, I don't know what would be. There was a newspaper account that said His golden chariot was a blaze of light. I have a friend, a Navajo painter, that I'm trying to talk into re-envisioning it as a painting. I'm looking forward to it. Now, the early trading posts, we have an idea what they are if we've ever been into to Hubble's. Now, early trading posts were about livestock. It was about the sheep, primarily. Horses, not so much. Cattle, not at all. But it was about livestock. The Navajo could sell wool. They could sell lambs. A lot of them were trying to build their herds after their time at Fort Sumner. What they called Hueldi, where they were kept captive after Kit Carson herded them there. And one of the things about wool prices, if you look at in the late 1800s, is wool price that goes like this. And the reason for that is tariffs. When there were protective tariffs, the wool market in the United States went up. And when the tariffs were removed, they went down. Well, the Democrats put in tariffs, and the Republicans put in tariffs to protect the American wool industry, and the Democrats, for international trade, took them down. And that is why I maintain, to this day, the descendants of all those early traders are all Republicans. And the traders were an interesting group. They came from all walks of life, came out here. Some of them hadn't even been old enough to have a walk of life. C.G. Wallace, who became a force in Zuni Jewelry, was a barber's apprentice from North Carolina. And I was talking to Mrs. Kelsey, whose husband was an early trader at Zuni many years ago. And she mentioned that, her husband, when he ran the trading post at Zuni for Ilfield Trading Company, hired CG. So a couple years later, I'm in CG's office at the De Anza Motel in Albuquerque, and we're starting off an interview. And I mentioned to him in passing, just to get the conversation rolling, I said, I understand you started out as a barber's apprentice and cut hair on. You've been talking to the widow Kelsey. Slammed his fist down, and I thought, okay, I think the interview is over. He was serious. I thought it was interesting as all get out, but it didn't fit with his narrative. He was the only person who got kind of prickly about their career. But a lot of them had some really interesting background. There was Robert Cupp, who took over his family's trading post at White Horse Trading, but only after he had started majoring in Latin and taking pre-med courses at UNM. And at some point, he apparently decided, you know what? The job back out at White Horse Trading Post looks a lot easier than this. And so he moved back out there to run the family business. The interesting thing is you think about, the trading posts, and they're buying and selling silver and rugs and Navajo weavings and so forth. Well, he was an outdoorsman, and he hired Navajo women to make tie flies for him that he then sold nationally. Wow. And they all came out of White Horse Trading Post on the reservation in the 1990s. But other people, got hired because their uncle had a store, and they would come out, and they might, after time, open their own store, get bankrolled by their uncle or somebody else. And sometimes, as one trader said to it, you just got tricked into the business. I was talking to Tobe Turpin Jr. some years ago, and he was actually an ace in World War II. And he never talked about it. I didn't learn about it till his memorial service. At one point, he'd gone after a Japanese Zero when the rest of his team was turning back because they were just at the point of no return. And he was determined to get it, and he did. And he came back, and his engine went dry within just eyesight of the carrier, and he landed with a dry engine on it. And the guy said, I'm going to write you up and give you a medal at the same time. But he explained that his father got into the business because his aunt and uncle had a trading post about 2 days' ride northeast of of Flagstaff. And, he was a 14-year-old kid, and his aunt and uncle said, hey, we got to go into Flagstaff and get some supplies, watch the place, and we'll be back. And he was like, I don't speak Navajo. And they go, oh, don't worry, Jake here, Navajo guy who managed the post, said, he does. So we just want you to stay here and, make sure nobody steals anything while we're gone. And they came back 3 months later. And at that point, he had learned some trading Navajo and gotten the hang of the business. So, and then Toby's telling me, he said, that kind of happened to me. He said, I got out of the war. I was a fighter pilot. I was hot shit. I'm just going to parties and the girls are loving me. And I'm promising my dad I'm going to go to UNM. And one semester goes by and another semester goes by and then another semester is in the process of going by. And his dad says, I got to check on our livestock, because I remember I was telling you the livestock was an important part of the business. And they would, buy lambs and ship them back to a ranch they owned in Oklahoma until they grew full size. And he said, I'll be back in a week or two. And Toby Jr. says, well, I don't speak Navajo. I don't know how to run this business. And he said, oh, don't worry. Harold, the Navajo manager, he can help you out. I just want you to stay here and make sure that, nothing gets stolen. 6 months later, he comes back and he's learned Navajo trading language. Being fluent in Navajo and speaking Navajo trading are two different things. They overlap, but they're not the same. And so at that point, he realized they really liked the business. But not all these trading posts were English speakers from back east. Bob Martin, Nellie Damon Black, Jack Nez, Klitzo Deadman were all Navajo people who owned trading posts. Plenty of managers, but these folks owned them in the early 1900s. So what we think of as being a Navajo trader, these guys and this woman were literally Navajo traders. There was a symbiotic relationship between the trading posts and the Navajo people on the reservation because they were isolated. And you hear about the pawn system, pawning jewelry and get you through until lambing season, or pawning jewelry until you could get through to shearing season on it. And the traders were in exactly the same boat. They were getting supplies from Spiegelbergs and all the other major trading houses, and they were getting them on credit. They weren't going to be able to pay them either until lambing season or wool season. So it was a system that they were both locked into. And getting back to the tariffs, what did you do when wool prices dipped? Well, the only way you're going to get your money out is if it's made into Navajo rugs. So Navajo rugs were a hedge against the wool market. And that was very important because these systems were operating in a bubble, if you will. And it wasn't until the Santa Fe Railroad and Fred Harvey started making inroads, they brought out tourists and brought out people who wanted to buy things. The only people buying things before then were expeditions for some of the museums that were collecting things, and mostly they wanted to collect older things, generally speaking, pottery. So the presence of the Santa Fe Railroad and the Harvey Company really changed everything. There's a book out on Fred Harvey jewelry, written by a lovely man. Unfortunately, it gives the impression that Fred Harvey made all this jewelry, or his company made all the jewelry. There was a brief period where they had some jewelry made in-house that's stamped with it, but for the most part, they bought it from the stores and the trading posts. And we used to call it, when I was growing up, railroad jewelry, because it's what showed up when the railroad showed up. But it got completed with Fred Harvey. And a lot of it is lots of stamp work, horses and arrows and sunsets and all kinds of symbols. And Herman Schweitzer is the one who had the genius to come up with the idea of creating a list of all these symbols and what they meant. Horses meant journey, suns meant whatever you wanted to make it. I mean, some said it meant good health, some said it meant friendship, and all these different designs. My dad cut one of those out and put it on a card with a cutout from a Hebrew national hot dog, and and said basically it was for the simple-minded. But it caught on, and you have to give credit to Herman Schweitzer. He was a marketing genius. The Pueblo people have been making double-spouted canteens since pre-contact times. And, you know, tourists weren't interested in double-spouted canteens, but you know what they were interested in? Wedding vases. So he renamed them, and they sold and still continue to sell like crazy. And they're not have never been part of a traditional Indian ceremony in any of the pueblos. So one day I'm in the shop, and a friend of mine from Jemez comes in, and he's got some storytellers to tell me, and lady's looking at a double-spouted canteen. You know, I go with the truth even when it costs me a sale. I'm not going to say it's a wedding vase. You know, I'll say people call it a wedding vase. That's as far as I'll go. So I was explaining to him what I just explained to you. And I see a kind of funny look on Cliff's face, and they leave, and he kind of comes over, and there's this sort of awkward moment. And he goes, you know, when my kids got married, their grandma made them a wedding vase. And I said, oh, I thought, okay, maybe I got this wrong. There's something flying under the radar here that I didn't see. And I said, really? He said, yeah. I thought, okay, let me put on my ethnographer's hat here for a minute. I said, so did Grandma have one when she got married? He said, I don't think so. I said, so what gave her the idea to make it? Oh, she saw it in a book. The tribes themselves had a rough time in transition because they, you know, some were ready to accept some degree of change. Others wanted to keep their traditional ways, and it was never so pronounced as it was at Hopi with the groups that the U.S. government deemed the hostiles and the friendlies. The friendlies were willing to send their kids off to boarding school where they were going to obviously not be present for all the traditional initiations and information, and the hostiles, you know, wanted to keep them at home. And ultimately, the hostiles were sent off to Alcatraz. And one man who became a well-known silversmith, Tawanimkawa, was sent off with them. And the, you know, for the papers in San Francisco, as was probably true in Cleveland or Philadelphia or New York, Indians were Indians. So when these, you know, I think it was 10 or 12 hapless Hopis got off the train to be transferred to Alcatraz, the paper breathlessly described them as murderous-looking Apaches and crafty Redskins. And later they learned that they were Hopis, and it was like, oh, never mind. But there were interesting events in that transition period from about 1910 into the 30s. There were people who, basically people were convinced they were disappearing. And actually people also talked as early as 1920 about Navajo rugs disappearing. Well, they haven't. I maintain it's because the Navajo weavers didn't read the book. But, you know, they continued, but there was, you know, obvious transitions. I mean, we don't live like our grandparents lived. They didn't live like their grandparents lived. Things change. Culture is constant. The only, you know, the cultures that haven't changed are like, oh, I don't think ancient Greek culture has changed in the last 500 years, but, you know, living cultures do change. Well, there was a lady, Daisy Nampeo, who was a potter. As a young woman, she'd had an infection. She got cataracts. And still haven't found out what the connection was, but a woman from California paid to have her cataracts removed. She'd seen her pottery and liked her, and had that done. And they developed a relationship because Daisy lived with her in California until her eyes were completely healed, and she saw a lot of potential to her. And she went with her to Paris and enrolled her into the École sorry, if you speak French, cover your ears, l'École des Beaux-Arts there. And she went there to study painting and sculpture. And she's the one that, there's a photo of her with kind of a bobbed hairstyle in a flapper dress with the Eiffel Tower behind her. And it gets even more interesting because Anita then took her around the world in the early 1930s to expose her to other forms of art and sculpture. But eventually she went home. She married a Hopi artist, Ray Naha, and then went to Zuni and married Leo Poblano, who was a well-known jewelry artist, and then finally Sidney Hui. And she was a potter, and so at Zuni what she did was she reinvigorated Zuni pottery. She was teaching pottery making at the school there. And so, it's interesting to see this exposure to the world at large and then coming back to your community with all of that experience and richness and making something of it that benefits others. Charles Lolema was another very fine example. He showed at l'Espace Cardin that Pierre Cardin invited him to, and he traveled to Egypt, and it influenced his work. And he showed other artists that you can be influenced by other work. There's nothing wrong with it as long as it's your interpretation of it. And Charles was probably the most innovative artist of the last century, and that could hold true for this century. It was really a remarkable time and a remarkable individual. But there are a lot of other people of interest. Millicent Rogers, for the museum in Taos, is named for her, and she was quite wealthy and collected, had excellent taste. And a certain trader at Zuni tells me the story of being a little boy hanging out with his buddies at Zuni, and he spoke fluent Zuni, still does. And they would once in a while, cobble up enough money to go to the movies in Gallup. So his parents prevailed upon Miss Rogers to take these 4 or 5 kids to Gallup. Well, one of them had never been in a car before, and he started to get car sick. And my friends said, Miss Rogers, I think you need to stop. And she was flying down the road. She just couldn't wait to get to Gallup and drop these kids off and be done with them. She wasn't running daycare. And finally he said, he's about to throw up. And of course she had a beautiful car. She slammed on the brakes, it fishtailed and practically pushed the little boy out, and he threw up and got back in the car and went on. But she had a different relationship with the artists than she did with their children there. And then there was one of my favorite characters. There were more murders, conspiracies, crimes between Gallup and Zuni in that general region than you can see on an entire season of CSI. It's just amazing. My favorite is Rattlesnake Annie. She had 7 husbands, one at a time. And she was very careful not to marry the next one until she finished marrying the old one. Now, don't ask me why the last 2 or 3 men married somebody named Rattlesnake Annie. I don't know what came over them, but they did. But in talking to some of these older traders, you begin to learn really fascinating things. You see Navajo stamp work, and then you figure they must have 30, 40 stamps or so. Some of the better silversmiths had hundreds of iron stamps that either they made or they paid somebody who was a tool maker to make for them on it, which confounds the possibility of saying, oh, that must be so-and-so's work because this one is documented as his work, so same stamp, it must be them. It's not. The Peschleich brothers were very famous silversmiths, and I thought, I'm going to document every single stamp they used, and I can create a fingerprint essentially for their work. I got up to about 57, 58 stamps and never saw one of them a second time. So it's pretty amazing. And some of the oral history that's out there that's just amazing. Mr. Van der Wagen was telling me that there was a guy, John Gordon Ligety, who had 2 Stetson hats, a yellow one and a green one. And the green one he reserved for when he was going trading. And the history behind the Stetson hats is C.G. Wallace decided early on, he was a shrewd entrepreneur, that these were going to be popular. So he created an exclusive deal with Stetson hats where all the ones sold in the Southwest would be sold through him, and all of them would say C.G. Wallace, Indian Trader on the hat band. So all the posts that wanted to sell them had to advertise for C.G. And these guys were amazing entrepreneurs. I mean, up through today, it's just, I was talking to a friend of mine, John Kennedy Jr., whose father, John Sr., was a good friend, died at 103. And the other businesses they got into, and the scale of the business they did in the boom period, you know, buying 300-400 rings a day, which meant they had to be selling almost that many a day to various suppliers and shops. I think the 1969 or 70 Gallup phone book listed about 30, 40 local Indian arts businesses and about another 20 some odd from the region. By 1975, there were nearly 800 listings for Indian art dealers in there. But he had an idea, Van der Wagen, you can guess, is he from Holland or not? And he had an idea of having the Zunis make little Dutch boy shoes to sell back there, because he and his wife had visited there and saw them and saw the prices on them and thought, I can beat that. And then it was another way of generating income for the Zuni people, which was an important part of how he approached his business. And he shipped them back and they fell flat. They just didn't sell. So they shipped these barrels, wooden barrels of these little Dutch boy shoes back. And so he thought, all right. So he gave them back, had everybody bead the edges of them and called them moccasins, and they sold like crazy in the Southwest. And there are certain commonalities to some of these stories of water, where the communities were founded, there was water. Where certain transactions went on, there was water. The earliest Zuni to learn silverwork was a man named Lanyade. He lived outside the village, but he happened to live near a very fine well. And so Navajos would ask to camp there, and he'd let them camp there. And one of them eventually agreed, after a number of years of enjoying his hospitality, to teach him how to work silver. So water had a lot to do with not only where things happen, but how things happen in the Southwest. But as I mentioned earlier, one of the big challenges for the sort of work that I'm trying to do is myths. And some are myths of convenience, some are myths made of whole cloth, some are marketing. A fellow named of Likia, until he got older, and then everyone called him Old Man Likia. Happened to a number of people at Zuni who were prominent. And he did both little animal carvings that we call fetishes, and then he carved these turquoise leaves, some small, some large. And there was another fellow named Kempsey Kushana who also did them. Kempsey was better at it. He was a much better lapidary. His work always had a higher polish. CG had spent a bunch of time and money promoting Likia. So Kempsey was kind of a distraction, so everything Kempsey made got sold as Likia to this day. But it is possible within reason to discern, because Kempsey's work has a much finer finish to it. And then there was Ambrose Lincoln and Ambrose Roanhorse. And into my 30s, everybody knew they were two different people, completely unrelated. They didn't particularly like each other because they were both Ambroses, and each thought the other was, trying to promote their work over the other one's work. Then about 15 years ago, a prominent dealer in mostly vintage but contemporary work in Santa Fe used to give seminars, and she determined that they were, if not brothers, then probably cousins, and then, there was speculation that maybe they were even the same person that changed hallmarks or whatever. I was dumbfounded. I was like, who came up with that one? And that's been a hard myth to put down. There was another one, and the thing about myths and stories is if they're interesting, people are inclined to believe them, particularly if they're even slightly plausible. The ones that are really hard to pull the plug on are the ones that not only meet that criteria, but serve an economic purpose. The most famous one is Tiffany Mine Turquoise. And it started, as near as I can tell, it started in the late 60s, but really got traction in the 70s during the boom period, which I refer to as the disco era in Indian jewelry. We got through it, we hope it never happens again. And so the story was to promote turquoise and promote a better price for it was that the Tiffany company out of New York bought a mine in New Mexico, turquoise mine in New Mexico. They didn't. Now they bought some turquoise from the Burro mine in the Azure Mountains, or maybe it's the other way around, the Azure mine in the Burro Mountains, but no matter. And it was beautiful turquoise, hard blue, clear turquoise, and it was the sort of thing that they also got from what was still then Persia, and was set with diamonds. But they never owned a mine, or an interest in a mine. And this will tell you how old this story is. They got so many inquiries about it, wanting to know more about it, or wanting some Tiffany turquoise, that they put together a mimeographed letter in response saying, basically, we are not now, nor have we ever owned a turquoise mine. And even though it came from the source, from the Tiffany company, people are like, oh, that's not true. Yeah, the origin of conspiracy theories, I think. And then there are other stories that I've heard from traders. A fellow named Slim Brasher ran Indian Jewelry Supply, and people said, oh yeah, he was a tall, good-looking guy. He was Gary Cooper's brother. No, he wasn't. And then I've had a couple of traders tell me that Bob Dylan used to come out for at least one summer and work at his uncle's store. There was a Zimmerman Hardware, and some of you may know that was Bob Dylan's original last name was Zimmerman. And they said, oh yeah, I remember this kid, he was kind of lazy, he was in back playing his guitar. Sorry, he never even made it to New Mexico when he was a kid. But it's a great story, so it lives on. And then there's one about Pendleton blankets, that the Navajo women would weave rugs and take in the rugs and get some money and then a Pendleton blanket in exchange. Well, I have a friend, Kathy McCloskey, who did a really deep dive on Navajo rugs and the economics of it through the Hubble papers that are at the U of A's special collections. She found out that wasn't true at all. Facts are so annoying. That in fact, Pendleton blankets were more expensive than Navajo rugs. So why did the Navajos use them and wear them instead of their own blankets? They were a prestige good. And so it was important to have a nice Pendleton blanket, whatever the cost. That sort of dynamic also extends to us with turquoise. People never used to ask my dad where the turquoise came from in the first decade or two I was in the business. No one asked where it was from. It was either, was it natural, and was it pretty? Did you like it? And end of discussion. But now it's like, where did it come from? Is it from this mine or that mine? And you can get turquoise that's almost identical that could be from either mine, but if you can't tell them which it is, they're not going to pay the price on. No, I'm sorry, that may look like Landers, but it's not, so I'm not going to pay the money for it. There's a mine in Hubei province of China that some of their material is a ringer for Landers turquoise, which is a blue turquoise with a very dark, tight web. Some number of pounds came out of it, a limited amount. But, if you put everything back in that hole that was said to be Landers, you not only fill up the hole, you'd have a big hill there. And you can't tell the difference, but, price-wise, the difference is for the best Chinese spiderweb turquoise from the Hubei mine, natural, is not quite $20 an ounce. For the Landers, $500 $500 a carat. And my little finger, assuming it wasn't a high dome or real thin stone, would be about a 4 or 5 carat stone. 5 times 500, $2,500. And that's the cost to the artist. So it's staggering. And everybody claims to have it. Oh yeah, if it fluoresces under UV, then it is or it isn't. And of course, that's not a test at all. And everybody's got a formula. But I did determine that there is a definitive test that will tell the difference between Landers turquoise and Hubei spiderweb turquoise. And it's really simple. If you have it, it's Chinese. If I have it, it's Landers. We think of, the lives of the people in the Pueblos on the Navajo reservation, and, long days, a lot of work, beautiful landscape, things of that sort, but hard work. One of the two things that brought people together were ceremonies. So a lot of Navajos would come to ceremonies at Zuni and up in Hopi country, and some would attend some of the Navajo ceremonies, but most of those are in winter, so the snow level would impact attendance. And that was an occasion for trading fruit for livestock or wool, all kinds of things got traded back and forth. Buffalo hides would change hands multiple times on their way to Zuni. But there were also horse races, and horse races throughout the West, as probably many of you know, were really popular. People lived and died and went broke on horse races, but it was just the joy of betting it. But the interesting thing about horse races is, we have an idea how horse races run, right? Bang, starts, across the finish line, there's the winner. No, at Zuni at least, and it appears to have been the case elsewhere, if you didn't like the result, you might run the race again. And maybe another time. And maybe later in the day, just try it one more time and just see what the results came out to be, until everybody kind of agreed. The Mormons over in Rama would bring their horses, the Navajo would bring their horses, the Zuni would bring their best horses to these races. And a Navajo guy named Austin Wilson bet heavily on a horse entered by a Zuni guy, last name of Arviso. And, multiple races, but the horse lost. And Austin got in his wagon and slapped leather, hell bent for leather, to across the Zuni line, because he did not want to lose that wagon. And for years afterwards, if he had to go down, because he lived between Gallup and Zuni, for groceries at Zuni, he would park his wagon a mile or two from Zuni and hitch a ride in to get his groceries and go back, because he was afraid the guy he lost the bet to might come for his brand new wagon. And the other thing that's been interesting, that's been vexing for me, is trying to track silversmiths to the records. Because for starters, writing Navajo names is difficult. Everybody had their own orthography. And a lot of people had tin ears. Navajo is very tonal sensitive in terms of rising and falling tones, a little bit like Chinese, which has 5 tones to it. And so consequently, even if the name doesn't change, the spelling is just drastic. John Adair, who did some wonderful work with Navajo and Pueblo silversmiths, I read his notes and he just about made me, give up and go into another line of work. But the other thing that would happen is your name might be Husky Sosi, it means skinny boy. Well, the years go by and maybe you're not so Sosi anymore. And so you wind up with a different name, but nobody announces it, nobody publishes it. Everybody just knows, yeah, that's that's Shorty now. That's just Chili. It's Curly. And there was a Zuni guy, supposedly named Mingo House, and it was odd. There was no Zuni last name House. It occurred, and Mr. Vanderwagen explained what it was. Is he'd send somebody over to it, and they would say, "I'm from Mingo House," and C.G. Wallace thought that was his name. It was actually Mingo Dooley. But the names are interesting to follow. But the relationship between the traders and the Indians is interesting. You hear everything from rosy accounts to, oh, they were cheated them all the time. And as with all things, the truth falls somewhere in the middle. You know, you have examples across the spectrum. One of them was Solomon Bebo, who actually married into Acoma and got himself named as head of Acoma for a while. And he signed a deal with the Acoma Pueblo for 95,000 acres that they owned at the time. A 30-year lease to all rights, water, grazing, everything on the land, for the princely sum of $400 a year. And he immediately turned it around and started subleasing to Anglo ranchers in the area and made a fortune on it. It's been interesting trying to track his history because one morning he was gone, and after living there for many, many years. And I've talked to a few people at Zuni who I think know the story, and they said, well, yeah, it's kind of interesting. And he left behind certain things, including a menorah and a few things that you would have expected him to take with him. And took his wife, who was Acoma, and his children to San Francisco, and never went back. And people tried to take him to court on it, but the BIA wouldn't, the government wouldn't consider a hearing against him. He was very popular, very influential, and so no judge wanted to enter a decision against him. And then you get other people, story I just learned like a week ago from Roland Begay, a Navajo silversmith who does those story bracelets. And he worked with a trader in Gallup named Leon Ingram, and he sold to other people too. And Leon sold a lot of his work, gave him gold to produce work. And one day he said he went in to Leon, and Leon said, I just want to thank you. You know, you really, more than anybody, any other one person, helped build my business. Now, Leon up to then had to buy at what we call jobbers, which is below wholesale, so that you have that little margin between what you paid for it and wholesale, typically 10%. It may have changed for some now. And if he sold retail, most people wouldn't say anything. But what he would do is at the end of the year say, look, I sold X number of pieces at retail, so here's the difference between jobber and wholesale. And they would give him a check for $2,000 to $4,000. But this particular day, Leon was getting ill, and you know, he needed to start tying up some loose ends. And he said, you know, you really built my business. You know, wouldn't be here without you. And handed him a check for $40,000. So, you know, there were some really standout people there. And Tom Keene was interesting. He was an Indian agent. He was very much an advocate for the Navajo people, and that cost him his job. And in fact, he was banned from the Navajo reservation, so he couldn't even trade there. The system for appointing Indian agents and then the agents appointing the traders was pretty corrupt. So he moved over to what became Keene Canyon, or now Keams Canyon, on the Hopi reservation, and continued to do his work there. And he had a Navajo wife, which is another reason they threw him out. You can have a Navajo girlfriend, but don't have a Navajo wife. And that was consorting with whatever. And that got him booted out. Well, eventually, Tom went back to Wales, which is where he was from originally. And he had 2 sons by this woman. And he left her with $25,000 in 1908 in trust to cover the boys' education so they could get all the way through college and get started in life. Pretty remarkable story. And a lot of people were, you develop those relationships, and over time, you don't cheat on your friends. You know, you treat them respectfully. And, you know, and you, early on in particular, those posts were pretty isolated. So, you know, you didn't want to, you know, create enemies when you were, you know, 100 miles in 2 days hard ride from a sheriff or something of that sort. But I want to leave you with the final story. I promised you a story about the Navajo who invested in diamonds. One of those great stories. I was waiting to ask a question at the Gallup Historical Society. And if you haven't been in their museum, you got to go. Because basically, it's populated with items where someone's grandpa dies and they go, what do we do with this stuff? We'll give it to the Historical Society. And they gratefully accept it and find out what to do with it. And they had a bunch of movie posters in there. And if you've seen the old movie posters, they have the main characters in front, the man, and usually the love interest, and then little vignettes of the other characters, fastest gun in the West, he knew he'd done wrong, and, woman, soiled dove, but heart of gold. On this one, it had this woman, and it said underneath her, the flaming lips of love. I so badly want that poster, but they weren't going to let go of it. But there was two binders there, and it was the Gallup newspaper from 1908 to 1910. So I'm flipping through it, and I'm noting that, none of these have addresses on them, because, Gallup was so small, you knew where they were. And I'm thinking, so why are they even advertising, But they were, and one of them had this fellow, Jacob Holzfeld, and it said, cut turquoise, 1908. I'm thinking, okay, where did he get his stone? Who cut it? And at that time, Idar Obenstein in Germany was a famous turquoise cutting locale. And so I talked to John Kennedy, who was then in his early 90s, and he said, no, I knew him, but that was before my time. So I stopped in on my way to see Tobe Turpin, who I was talking to, doing an appraisal and interviewing him. And he had just gotten back from a trip to Taos, and he quit driving in his late 80s. His family said, you shouldn't drive anymore. And he said, I agree. He said, get me a driver. And so people would line up to drive him places because he had all these wonderful stories. And he said, remember when you were asking me about Jacob Wurzburger? And I said, yeah. And he goes, this is his granddaughter. I said, whoa. So, I asked her, my question. I said, where did he get the turquoise cut from? And one thing she was certain of it, that he sent it off to New York to get cut. So I thought, a new lead, because nobody's ever talked about turquoise cutting in New York before. Somebody's going to follow up. And so I thanked her and went on to see Toby, and I said, I just met Jacob Wurzburger's granddaughter. He said, that's nice. Did she tell you how her grandpa got She Dodge to invest in diamonds? I'm like, no, that didn't come up. And what it was the early 30s. The Depression has got a grip on everybody, particularly in the rural areas. And Wurzburger's got diamonds that he cannot sell. And She Dodge was the wealthiest man in the territory back in his day. When Lorenzo Hubble ran for U.S. Senate, She Dodge backed him. But She Dodge was also a hell of a businessman, because there's a note in those papers in special collection. He made his good buddy sign an interest-bearing note. He was not going to rely upon favored legislation. He was like, I want my money back. And so he contacted She Dodge, and she apparently came in, and he explained about the diamonds, and that there was once a really strong market for them. With the Depression, it's down, but it's going to come back. And she was a savvy businessman. He goes, okay, keep talking. And he said, I've got to get my money out to turn it into inventory that I can turn. And these were not little dinky diamonds. These were all the way up to a pair of 2-carat diamonds. And apparently, in the 40s, some trader in Gallup bought them for his wife. I would love to know who, but nobody seems to know. So She Dodge bought them, and then some years later sold them at a handsome profit. And end of story. Not quite. So I'm visiting with Sally Lippincott, who's with her husband had run the Wide Ruins trading post. So I tell her this story. She goes, oh, you don't know the half of it. I said, keep talking. And she explains that they had decided they were going to sell the post and move into Gallup. And their accountant, been looking at the books and said, yeah, I'll buy it. And they said, okay, it was going to be on time. So they were staying kind of vigilant. And, he gets up there and looks through the books and, who owes how much money. And there's Annie Juanica, Chi Dodge's daughter, and she owes way more than anybody else. So I'm thinking, I better reel this in because this is obviously out of control. She owes us a lot of money. I don't know how she's going to pay it. So she sent word for her to come in. Boy, did that piss her off. She was mad. She came in, slammed down this ring on the counter and said, there, that'll take care of it, and stormed out. So I looked at it, looks like a diamond ring, and he's going, what Navajo owns a diamond ring? So he locks up and drives hell-bent to town, takes it into a jeweler. He said, no, this is a diamond ring, and it turns out to be worth more than the debt you said that you collected on it. So that was how a Navajo came to be an investor in diamonds. And, there's undoubtedly more stories out there than that, and I enjoy collecting them. I enjoy talking to the folks who remember that. And just like I did yesterday or day before yesterday with Roland Begay, always learning something new, and always excited to pass it on. And I'm serious, and I think Volume 2 is going to be everything that didn't fit into Volume 1. So, anyhow, I thank you very much for your time and your hospitality. Oh, yeah.
We would welcome a few minutes of questions. Anybody?
Oh, let me add one thing. That's what my publisher keeps asking. I'm still hoping to wrap up the text by the end of the year, but that's going to take some serious focus and concentration. Also, a friend of mine, Lauren Aragon, who's a fashion designer who's been building a label called Akanov over the last 6-8 years. Really interesting guy. He said, be sure you tell him that I'm going to be doing a fashion show at your place on February 24th. So I've done it. So I can tell him I did. Oh, it's at 350 South Convent, which next door to Terry Etherton's gallery, or if any of you know where Coronet is or where Cushy Street Bar and Grill is, we're on the diametrically opposite corner there. And beautiful building. We share a patio with Etherton. I'm so happy with this spot. It's just really great. Any other questions? Yes.
We just stopped in Cameron
Mm-hmm.
at the trading post. It's the only trading post in Maine. Is that a typical trading post?
For what they call a trading post now, yeah. The traditional trading post, would also sell, goods and groceries and things of that sort, and generally didn't have LED lighting. The last one that I consider traditional was at Shanto, which is just still one of the most beautiful spots on the whole reservation there.
Where's that?
Shanto is basically between Tuba City and Kayenta. It's just a few miles off the road there on the north side there, and you drop down into a canyon that will remind you of Canyon de Chelly. But trading posts, starting back in the 70s, began to disappear in favor of convenience markets and things of that sort. Thank you.
Will you come back and tell us more stories?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was just rich and fabulous. And I hope that all of you get a chance to get down to that new gallery.